applause. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is LP Picard. I am the director of One Book, One DU, and I'm a faculty member in the University Writing Program. It is my great honor to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of University Academic Programs and our co-presenter, the Newman Center. Thank you for joining us at an evening with Helen Thorpe. How do individuals from a wide range of backgrounds and value systems become a community? This is the challenge and reward at the heart of One Book, One DU, a program dedicated to building community through a series of shared intellectual experiences inspired by a common text. We are here tonight to celebrate and dive deeper into that book, Helen Thorpe's The Newcomers, Finding Refuge, Friendship, and Hope in America. And that question is also at the heart of Thorpe's investigation. How do 21 students from 11 countries, their teachers, and a journalist form a community in Denver South's room 142? From one perspective, a romantic one, we might consider this a narrative of starting over. We watch as these young newcomers arrive in a foreign and unfamiliar place and then begin to thrive. We witness their families navigate life in a new culture and a new system, and we encounter passionate people dedicated to helping ease that adjustment. So yes, in one sense, this book answers the question, what is possible with a fresh start? But we see from Thorpe's writing that reality is much more complex. We don't ever really start over. We carry our pasts with us. Those experiences shape us, leave an indelible mark. They manifest in our schoolwork, our aspirations, our responses to setbacks. We carry people with us too. As much as we might want to focus on a lesson or contribute to a group activity, our minds drift to loved ones about to embark upon a dangerous journey. So perhaps it is better to say that the Newcomers asks, how do we keep going? How do we forge ahead and find renewed purpose? And crucially, how do we build alliances to help us along the way? The Newcomers has been praised for offering humanity in a time of great anxiety and for being a timely and much-needed perspective on the global refugee crisis. With our Q&A later in the program, we will have an opportunity to continue this dialogue. But a goal of tonight's event is also to consider questions of craft. I worry sometimes that our media has given us false impressions of what makes a great storyteller and what makes a great journalist. We believe the author is just fortunate enough to have a unique life and a compelling style, and then sits down at a typewriter or now a computer, and in one go churns out a moving tale. And the journalist is a skilled sleuth who digs deep enough and asks just the right questions and gathers enough evidence and delivers us the truth, a carbon copy of their discoveries. But that's not the process, and we wouldn't want it that way anyway, especially from our journalism. We don't want just a list of mimetic details and chronicle of events. We don't want reality unfiltered. We want it to be made meaningful. We want it to be turned into a story. So authors and journalists are faced with countless decisions. What is important? How should something or someone be described? What is the significance of seemingly insignificant details? How to take everything that happened over the span of a year and a half, the experiences of 21 students, teachers, staff, 2 families, 14 translators, combined with broader local, national, and global events, and turn it into a single book. Spinning a yarn is a daunting enough task to begin with. When it involves someone else's experiences, there is added pressure to tell it responsibly, to render without distorting, with both generosity and honesty. It requires more than just craftsmanship. It requires empathy and integrity. I couldn't think of 2 better words to use to describe this year's One Book selection. So let's get to business then. I want to give you a quick rundown of our program. Helen Thorpe will come out to read an excerpt of The Newcomers. She will then be joined on stage and interviewed by DU's own Heather Martin, who will moderate a Q&A with you all. If you've noticed, there are some microphones in the aisle on every level. We will invite you to form lines and share your questions. So to keep things running smoothly, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Heather N. Martin, is a writer, professor, and speaker. She received her PhD in creative writing from the University of Denver, where she is a teaching professor in the writing program and the faculty director of the first-year seminar program. Her recent publications include Divorce and Death by Crushing in Argot Magazine and High Places in Barnstorm Literary Review. Over 16 years of teaching, she has helped thousands harness the power of writing and communicate more effectively. Every day, her students inspire her to be a better teacher, a better writer, and a better person. And of course, I have the immense pleasure of introducing our author. Helen Thorpe was born in London to Irish parents. She was formerly a staff writer for the New York Observer, the New Yorker's Talk of the Town section, and Texas Monthly. Thorpe's magazine journalism has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, Texas Monthly, Westward, Chalkbeat, and 5280. She's the author of 3 books, Just Like Us, Soldier Girls, and the Newcomers. Her books are works of narrative nonfiction that document in human and intimate ways the lives of immigrants, refugees, and veterans of foreign conflicts. She lives in Denver, Colorado, so please join me in welcoming Helen Thorpe to the stage.
Thank you so much. I have been in this amazing building so many times, sitting in the seats that you're sitting in as an audience member, and never up on this stage. So this is an amazing experience for me to kind of turn things around. Thank you to everybody at the university for this opportunity. I was saying a moment ago that to me this feels like an author's dream, to have people not only read the book that you wrote, but dig in and use it in conversation and in dialogue. And I couldn't be more honored or thrilled to have this happening on this campus. So I'm going to just give a very brief intro and sail into my reading, and then we'll have more of a conversation. But this morning, I opened up my email, and I get a news brief every day from the United Nations because they track news about refugees, and I'm always interested in staying up to speed. And the challenge of understanding and relating to the refugee crisis was made apparent in one of the stories that they shared. It was from the BBC, and it was a wonderful piece of journalism. It was filled with visualizations to summarize what was happening right now. So the BBC was letting us know that the number of displaced families has reached another high. It has tripled over the past 25 years. The number's now 71 million people, and there were 35,000 new people displaced every single day in the year 2018. 35,000 every day. So the problem there for me is it's really hard to empathize with 71 million people at one time. And it's really hard to care about 71 million people at one time, or even understand what is their journey, what is their predicament, what are they suffering, what is hard about the experience, because it just seems so vast. And there's a part of us, I think, that almost shuts down when we hear a number so large or a catastrophe so big. And we, I think, lose our capacity to feel something really meaningful. So in the Newcomers, what I was trying to do was tell some stories about some families who had been displaced and had had the great fortune, the amazing good luck to be invited to resettle in a safe home, and to essentially try to share refugee stories, but at a very human level. So tonight I want to talk about one family that I got to know in the course of this book, and that is a family from the Middle East, originally from Iraq. I was instantly curious about Jacqueline and Mariam when they walked into the newcomer classroom at South High School. So they arrived clearly sisters, speaking Arabic and some other languages, but not yet very much English. And within days of their arrival, Jacqueline began wearing a hijab, or a headscarf, and her sister Mariam did not. And to me, this was a mystery that I wondered about. Were the girls Muslim? Did they agree on what that meant or how they should represent themselves? Had they had different experiences in America? What had those been like? Why were they kind of responding differently in this way to their heritage and coming here? I had all these sorts of questions. And because I had been invited into this very special classroom, I also thought my job was basically not to ask the girls all of those things, as they were just coming here, arriving after a very difficult set of experiences and trying to get settled at South High School. So I held those questions kind of inside myself and was a presence in that room for 6 months before I began to hire interpreters. And when I did hire interpreters, Jacqueline and Mariam were among the students who immediately said they wanted to tell me their story. So I asked if I could meet their mom. They did tell me a little bit about their story at school, but I didn't feel right interviewing students without their parents' very clear, explicit understanding that I was a journalist speaking to their kids. And so if the students wanted to talk to me, I tried to very quickly say, let's see what your parents say about this. So I'm going to read to you a little bit now from a moment sort of very far along in the school year when I had been kind of spending a lot of time with Jacqueline and Mariam in their classroom, and also many evenings at home with them, with their mother, Ebtisam. And one thing that had become very clear was that the girls had a number of struggles. One was that their father was missing and presumed dead, and they were incredibly sad about his absence. And their mom had explained to me on one of my visits that he had worked with the U.S. military when we invaded Iraq. And after that, their family was targeted, and that's when they had to flee from Iraq. They had sought safety in Syria, experienced the Syrian civil war, and become double refugees. I think there are many people in the audience who've read the book and know all of that, but I'm giving some background for those who are here and need that. So after quite a bit of time, then I think the girls started to open up without me really directly asking them. They began sharing things with me, and this was an amazing turn in our time together. For a long time, I'd been wondering what Jacqueline carried within. She had adopted the hijab without saying why, and then later taken it off, also without much of an explanation. Not Bad was about as explicit as she had been in terms of naming her inner state. All year long, she kept herself veiled emotionally. That spring, however, as the park burst into color and the classroom came to life, Jacqueline also began to reveal herself. One day, toward the end of April, she watched her classmate Lisbeth engage me in a full-on headlock of an embrace. This had happened because I had inadvertently made Lisbeth feel embarrassed. Lisbeth is from El Salvador and speaks Spanish. I had asked in English, "What's your favorite food?" And Lisbeth had answered happily, "I'm doing fine. How are you?" I had laughed out loud. Then I had said to her in Spanish, "Lisbeth, no, I'm asking, what's your favorite food?" And she had said, "Oh, pupusas." And then she gave me the big slamming hug to accommodate her embarrassment. Jacqueline took all this in. Then she walked over with her composition notebook and opened it up to a page of black, flowing script. She knew I loved the way Arabic handwriting looked. Previously, Mariam and Jacqueline had spent an entire lunch hour amusing me by writing derogatory things about one another in beautiful yet indecipherable letters heading right to left across Mr. Williams' whiteboard. When I asked Mariam what had she written about her sister, she said gleefully, "Jacqueline is a donkey." And when I asked Jacqueline to translate her response, she replied, "Mariam is a fish." But what was in her composition notebook? Jacqueline stared expectantly at me. I figured she wanted to share something with me too, just like her classmate, but she possessed a more restrained personality, and she had opened her notebook instead of her arms, and her face was saying, "Look at this." She was sharing something important, I knew, but the page she offered was covered in that gorgeously drawn but unreadable to me script. All I knew was that she was saying something from her heart. I told her I wished I could read Arabic. "Yes, yes," she said impatiently. She grabbed her cell phone. She typed speedily into Google Translate. I could see various English phrases start to pop up. Her cell phone said alternately, "Do you like poetry? Do you like Allah? And then, do you like amchi?" That satisfied her. She held up that question. What was amchi? I had no idea. "Jacqueline, I don't understand. I am so sorry," I told her. She tapped her notebook and said, "My father." "This is a letter to your father?" "Yes." I asked if I could photograph the pages. Maybe someone could translate them for me. She nodded. When I ran my fingers over the paper, it was like reading Braille inversely. She had pressed down so hard, the script was palpable. Although I couldn't read the letter, I liked that she had written it in Arabic because it made me wonder, what did she sound like in her own language? I'm going to skip forward to the part of the book where we get to hear what was in the letter. 2 weeks later, we decided to celebrate the fact that her mother, Ebtisam, had gotten a job and her driver's license and a semi-functional car. I brought takeout food from a Middle Eastern restaurant called Jerusalem, not that far away from here. Nabiha and I found Mariam sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of a mirror leaning against the living room wall. Nabiha is my translator who accompanies me all the time when we visit. Her mother was out running errands, Mariam said. Jacqueline helped us unpack the food while Mariam applied black eyeliner and then pulled her hair into a ponytail. She changed into a red mini dress. "Are you getting dressed up for us?" I asked, "or do you have plans later?" Mariam said through Nabiha she was going out. "Where are you going?" I asked. "I'm going to check the mailboxes," Mariam announced. "You're getting dressed up to check for the mail?" "Yes." "Do you meet exciting people when you check the mail?" "I hope so." Mariam explained she was waiting for a package because her face had broken out, and a friend was mailing acne medication from Iraq. Nabiha began to Google acne remedies on her cell phone, trying to show Mariam she could buy ointments for pimples in the United States. But Mariam was excited to leave the apartment and departed on her much-anticipated walk because who knew, she might meet someone interesting. Jacqueline said we should sit on the living room floor for dinner because that was the traditional way. Nabiha and I helped pull the coffee table out of the way, and we put the tablecloth down on the floor. We transported food there, and the girls arranged a festive spread. Mariam returned, and Ebtisam arrived home feeling triumphant because she had had a good day at work. We sat down cross-legged and used pieces of Iraqi flatbread to scoop up hummus and baba ganoush. We passed around plates of beef kebabs, lamb chops, chicken shawarma. Ebtisam hopped up to get cans of Coke and Sprite, then told us about her adventures at the DMV. "Did you get somebody who was nice?" I asked. "Nice? No," Ebtisam said, making a face. "Turn left, turn right," she barked, imitating the gruff manner of the person who had given her the test. The girls enjoyed the show. Then Ebtisam bent her right arm and showed us her bicep. I am very strong, she meant. After we ate, Mariam handed her mother an envelope. The family-run business where she worked had mailed Ebtisam a greeting card because the day before had been her birthday. She had been so preoccupied with her new job and getting a driver's license, she had forgotten. Getting up early and figuring out the routine at the factory and learning to drive seemed to have expelled any other thoughts from her mind. We marked Ebtisam's forgotten birthday by lighting a large white candle and holding it over the baklava, wax dripping onto the pastry. We all sang happy birthday in English, and then Ebtisam muttered a prayer in Arabic before she blew out the candle. Ebtisam's daughters were in a playful mood now. Lulu took over washing dishes because it was her mother's birthday. Somehow Nabiha and I wound up talking about sounds that exist in Arabic, but not in English. Nabiha made some throaty noises, which I tried but failed to emulate, to the great delight of Jacqueline and Mariam. The sisters invented a new game, which they found side-splitting. They would say the name of someone famous in Iraq, a movie star, a musician, well known to everybody else in the room, and then demand that I pronounce the name too. Kadim al-Sahir, Jacqueline cried. Kadim al-Sahir, I repeated, perfectly to my ears. The girls shrieked. Mariam laughed until she started crying. Then she began pounding the green leather sofa with both hands. What's so funny? I wanted to know. It just sounds strange when you say it, Nabiha said in a comforting tone of voice. It's hard for you. You don't know these sounds. Nazim al-Ghazali, cried Jacqueline. Nazim al-Ghazali, I said in perfect imitation. The girls howled again. Mariam clutched her stomach, doubled over with her head between her knees. Eventually, Ebtisam turned on the television, and we caught the tail end of a news report. The family paid close attention to the news from the Middle East. The big news from that region was in Aleppo, Syria. Bomb strikes had just demolished a hospital, killing perhaps the last pediatrician in the city. War proved a subject too heavy for the evening, and the girls asked, would I like to see their favorite YouTube videos? Jacqueline connected her cell phone to the TV, and we watched a series of belly dancing clips. The first video featured a woman in a green bikini top and a long green skirt who thrust her hips from side to side with astonishing rapidity and then did a serpentine move that involved slithering back to front for a while and making her chest jut out very abruptly. This routine had attracted 4.3 million views. One buxom woman wearing another outfit, a red bikini top and red skirt split up the side to reveal a fair amount of leg, enacted a routine that mostly involved standing still and jiggling everything that would jiggle. I found this unintentionally hilarious, but Ebtisam said in all seriousness, as she watched this woman dance, very, very beautiful. During a lull in the conversation, I told Jacqueline I was grateful she had shared the letter with me she had written to her father. It was a beautiful piece of writing, I said. The translation read like this. My father, after your departure, my heart went into a terrible silence that created fears and sadness inside me forever. I am overwhelmed by missing you. I feel the world has compressed into a speck and all its colors have been drained. My days are mixed with sorrow and sadness. I miss you, and life is loneliness, sadness, and sorrow when you are not here. I have lost my smile, and my dreams have disappeared, and my future has evaporated. It burns me that I will never be able to return home and see you again, that I will never wake up and find you back, that I will never hear your voice echoing around our house. I pretend to smile, keep busy, but this has all been in vain because my heart is too sad. I wish you could see me in my wedding dress. I wish you could see the outcome of all the effort and help you offered me, the results of your care and your interest in my future. I wish you could celebrate what I have become. My tears have not stopped since your leaving. That evening kind of continued and went on, and I thanked her for sharing that letter with me, which I found so profound. The first time I could hear how eloquent she was in her home language when somebody finally translated it for me. But Jacqueline and her family, they were carrying so much. The absence of her father was one thing. The other thing that Jacqueline named later that she said really complicated her time here was that in the Middle East, she felt she had always been treated with respect. And after finding a safe home here, she was very, very grateful to be safe, because some of the other places she had lived, like Syria, had been unsafe. And so she was extremely grateful to be safe. But she suffered from a feeling that people didn't respect her heritage. And she was, of course, arriving at a time when conversation about being from the Middle East or speaking Arabic, or as in her case, being half Muslim and half Christian, being of Muslim persuasion, was becoming discussed in our country in a way that did not feel to her respectful. And so I mention that because I think that Jacqueline wanted to share with me a lot about who she was and how she felt, and this incredible letter that she wrote after feeling that it was safe to do so because she had been shown respect. And honestly, I did not always know the right way in her culture to show respect. I just kept trying. And in the book, I kind of write a little bit about making some mistakes along the way, because sometimes you don't completely know how to show respect to someone if you're operating across a cultural divide or division. But I think that idea of showing respect to one another is just the note that I wanted to end on or close with, because as the students come to DU together from all over the United States and all over the world and are sharing their different backgrounds with one another, my wish is that they find ways to show respect to one another, that they notice what feels respectful to them and learn even how to treat themselves with respect and bring themselves to each class and every interaction with the generosity that comes when you treat yourself with respect and you find relationships where you can be treated with respect. So that's my wish. Jacqueline's wish was for respect, and I guess I'm sharing her wish for that with all of you. Thank you. Microphone. We're getting re-mic'd again here. Okay, does that work?
Thank you. Good evening. That was wonderful. Thank you. It will come as no surprise to all of you who just listened to that talk to learn that Helen Thorpe, earlier this month, was inducted into the Colorado Authors Hall of Fame with, Her fellow inductees included former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, photographer John Fielder, and an author you may have heard of, Stephen King. So we are so grateful to have you here as part of our community. You are truly a Colorado State treasure, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought we would start at the beginning or thereabouts. When did you decide that you wanted to write this book? When did you say to yourself, I'll spend a year in a high school with teenagers from across the world?
I think that the confidence that I could write this book actually came very late in the process, and really not until about halfway through the school year. So this project came about when I visited South High School, knowing that they had an incredibly diverse student body and students from all over the world there, and that they were one of the magnets in Denver Public Schools for kids arriving whose schooling had been interrupted and who are arriving speaking perhaps many other languages, but maybe not that much English. And I was really curious about these families coming with refugee status, so I was asking the principal there, who was just a knowledgeable person about refugees, did she think I could contribute in some way to understanding, and what project might I work on? And she invited me to spend a year there. And I was in the newcomer classroom with students who had just arrived and didn't speak enough English to really tell me anything about themselves. And they couldn't understand maybe even who I was. And I felt absolutely flummoxed by these circumstances. I remember calling my editor in New York and saying, I cannot possibly write a book about this room or these students. I don't have any way of getting to know them. It's just not gonna, I mean, I don't know the main characters. I can't tell what their personalities are like. There's not really that much dialogue happening in the room yet. The kids are like too scared to talk in the very first days of arrival. And my editor said, well, that all sounds really interesting to me. Why don't you just stay there for a while? So I did. And really not till I was able to hire the translators. I waited until 6 months had passed when I felt the kids were more settled and the families more settled, and then began inviting interpreters to come allow me to introduce myself to them, and then ask their parents for permission to speak with them. And so only when the interpreters began showing up, and then I was able to actually have conversations, then suddenly, whole vistas were opening up where I could hear people's stories. It became utterly fascinating. And then I thought I could write a book. Yeah.
Well, and to do this project, you befriended 22 students, you hired translators in 14 languages across 5 alphabets.
Yeah.
So there were tremendous barriers to communication between you and the students. So there was the obvious language barriers, but also cultural barriers, religious barriers.
Yeah.
I wonder if there isn't a larger lesson. You were able to connect with them despite all of those barriers. So I wonder if, when it seems like so much of our world is lost in translation, what can we learn from the work that you did?
I guess I would say the answer from my point of view, and there were all those barriers that you named and more. I mean, there were class barriers, age barriers, on and on. The answer to me is to slow down. I think it takes time to get to know people, and journalists are typically on incredibly short deadlines and forced into a situation where they may be a beat reporter where they know a certain beat, and then they might be very knowledgeable, but often the short deadlines can force journalists to be more superficial. And what I have tried to do with the luxury of support from a publishing house that was willing to kind of have me just like sit in this room for a whole year and wait to see what would happen, was to take my time getting to know people. And Jacqueline didn't share that letter till April. And it was voluntary. She came up to me because she wanted to share that she wanted people to understand what she was living through. But that didn't happen in August or September, or October, November, December, not in January or February or March, where Nabiha and I started spending time at their home. It took many months. And it's a slow dance you do getting to know one another. And I think that idea of attempting to show respect and trying to be I'd always tried to show up at the house with something. Of course, the first time I went, I brought all these treats like baklava, and Jacqueline and Mariam, their sister Lulu, and their mom Ebtisam had spent the whole day baking treats for me, which is great moment where we're both trying to feed each other. I think sharing meals with people, I think meeting in the home, really investing time and listening really hard and being willing to make mistakes. I made plenty of mistakes. I didn't get it right all the time. And I tried to write about that in the book to show people that if you do try to cross a lot of the divisions in our society, you will make mistakes, and it can still lead to wonderful exchanges, and it still can be worth pursuing relationships. It's all the more worth pursuing those relationships. Yeah.
In the book, the topic of war seems to be one of the few places where language fails.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could reflect on some of those challenges in confronting some of the traumas that the students have dealt with,
Right.
and how you communicated with them about those kinds of issues.
Before this book, I think one of the reasons that the principal invited me into the school was because I had written about undocumented students previously, but I had also written about members of our military who had served overseas and come back and had experienced some difficulty and came back with post-traumatic stress. So I think she looked at me and saw somebody who might understand some of the things her students had lived through because of the earlier books. And given that previous experience, I decided that I wouldn't ask the students about traumatic things. Some of them did mention things to me. Jacqueline and Mariam mentioned that when they fled Iraq, thinking they went to a safe place, when they lived in Damascus, that there had been terrible car bombings in their neighborhood, and that many of their neighbors that they had known had died, over 100 people. And I didn't ask for any details. I knew that that would be re-traumatizing. I felt that it was really important in some ways to learn how not to be a journalist in this room in order to be a good person and do right by the students. But then the challenge was how to convey to the reader the incredible difficulties the families had faced on the home front that forced them to be displaced in the first place. And there's a moment where I visit one family at home, and the father says to me, in a very gentle kind of confrontation, really, have you seen war? And it's a lovely question, and in the sense that he's calling me out on what I don't know. And I had to admit to him, I haven't. And really, I'm therefore not the right person to tell his story. The interpreter that I had hired for that encounter, at that point, takes off his jacket to show us he's wearing his King Soopers work uniform because he has to go from translating to his day job right after our interview. And his name tag says Julius, one of the lost boys. So the interpreter, in this case speaking Swahili, is from Sudan and has lived through war. And the father turns and says to him, "Oh, so you know what war is." And I'm admitting that to them that the wars this country has fought are not on home soil. I haven't seen anything like what they've seen. And that's just what it is. I'm just ignorant of some of the things that they're carrying. And at that point in the book, I write that the two men looked at me and I felt they were thinking, what are we supposed to do about the terrible innocence of Americans? Because we're such a powerful country, and unless we've served in the military, often we don't know what's happening in war zones. And that's kind of the conundrum of being an American and trying to understand the refugee crisis and the importance of refugee resettlement. We don't know what we don't know.
As a reader, I think one of the things that was most remarkable about the book was an almost sort of level of obsession around learning and understanding where the students have come from. So even traveling to the Democratic Republic of Congo to really sort of understand where they're coming from. Why was it so critical for you to really dig in and try to understand where they're coming from?
Well, I didn't want to burden these students or families with trying to tell me exactly what happens before a family has to flee from a very difficult situation. But I felt the reader had to know. And so an opportunity came up where some instructors from the Air Force Academy were going to the Democratic Republic of Congo during the summer, right after this school year ended, and invited me along on the trip. And I felt safe going with them. I also knew that the Congo was the #1 sender of refugees to the US that school year and in subsequent years. And I felt that because the conflict in the Congo was so long, it's also the conflict we know the least about, because our media is obsessed with the Middle East and recent conflicts, but it forgets to write about long-running conflicts of greater duration. So that felt like the right place to go if I wanted to visit one home country. And I tried to show by visiting there what it was that families with kids in the room had been forced to experience and flee from, and also tried to show the reader what life was like in a refugee settlement. And in particular, the thing about the refugee resettlement that was really important to understand was that it was almost impossible to stay in school and finish high school. So if you were a kid in the refugee settlement, you were almost certainly not going to get the kind of education that somebody would get here. And so resettlement was the chance for the younger generation to actually have an education. That's why it's so important to get families out of the refugee camps, I feel. Yeah.
So this is your second book that really focuses on the teenager.
Yeah.
Is there something about that population that you find really engaging or interesting?
Well, teenagers, I mean, as you see in the part that I read, are way more fun than grown-ups, first of all. And humor goes a long, long way if you're going to tackle challenging subjects to sort of lighten things. But I think I stumbled on how great the teenage years are to write about, in part because my first book was about undocumented students. And it is during the teenage years that their predicament really starts to escalate and become a very big problem. So an undocumented child legally goes to school, must go through K-12 education. That's gone up to our Supreme Court. But to do anything after 12th grade, it becomes very hard if you're undocumented. And, you know, everything is a challenge as you reach the adult years when, you know, it can be hard to get funding for college. It can be hard to work legally. Now we have DACA, hopefully for the future, we'll see. At the point when I was writing about undocumented students, it didn't exist yet. But it was because I chose teenagers then, because it was the crux of the issue, was them coming of age. And I guess I just fell in love with what teenagers have to offer us, which is, you know, they're in transition to adulthood. And so you see the adult issues, but it's kind of through a different lens, and it's all much more funny.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so glad that you talked about Ebtisam and her daughters in your talk. And I know you're very judicious about sharing information beyond the pages of your books about the families, but as a single mother of 2 almost teenagers, that story resonated with me, and I just hope so much that they're doing well.
They're doing great. I just saw them at an event. It was a fundraiser for Project Worth More, which is one of our refugee-serving organizations, and I didn't know they were going to be there, and suddenly there was Ebtisam with her arms open coming across the room, and Jacqueline was with her. Jacqueline had just gotten her high school degree through an alternative program. She didn't finish at South, but she got her degree elsewhere. And Ebtisam was going to community college and getting English, and her English was so much more proficient. So it was just amazing to see how far they had come.
Oh, that's so good to hear.
Yeah.
So there are a number of, yes.
Yeah.
So I know there are a number of students in the room, and as a writing teacher, I have been able to observe the power of writing, and not just on audiences, but also the transformative power of writing on authors themselves. So I wonder if you cast back, was there a piece of writing that you authored earlier, perhaps when you were a student or earlier in your career, that was transformational for you?
You know, when I showed up at college, I was absolutely convinced I was either going to be an engineer or a physicist. We have these ideas when we're young. And then that quickly became clear that that was not happening. And so soon I was in history classes and enjoying them, but also just really loving my English classes. And I took an English class on narrative nonfiction in which we read James Agee's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And it's a book published a long time ago about tenant farmers in the United States during the Great Depression. So just very extreme poverty during a time in this country when people were economically more hard-pressed than at any other time. And that book and that class kind of turned my life around and pointed me in this direction. So
Thank you for sharing.
a college professor changed my life.
Of course.
Yeah.
So the audience has been waiting, so I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions, and I believe there are some microphones stationed in the two center rows here, so feel free to hop up there for questions. I'd like to close in looking at the epigraph that you chose to start your book. I always tell my students, read the epigraph. It's this message from the author trying to tell you something about their work. And I think the one that you chose is really beautiful. So if you don't mind, I'd love to share it with the audience, and then if you wouldn't mind telling us why you chose this piece as your epigraph. So the epigraph is from Parker Palmer's A Circle of Trust, and it says, "From time to time, deep in the thickets of my inner wilderness, I could sense the presence of something that knew how to stay alive, even when the rest of me wanted to die. That something was my tough and tenacious soul. Yet, despite its toughness, the soul is also shy. Just like a wild animal, it seeks safety in the dense underbrush, especially when other people are around. If we want to see a wild animal, we know that the last thing we should do is go crashing through the woods, yelling for it to come out. But if we will walk quietly into the woods, sit patiently at the base of a tree, breathe with the earth, and fade into our surroundings, the wild creature we seek might put in an appearance. We may see it only briefly and only out of the corner of an eye, but the sight is a gift we will always treasure as an end in itself."
I think that epigraph is there for kind of two reasons. The first is that for a long time, my spiritual home has been Quaker Meeting, and Mountain View Friends Meeting is actually walking distance from this campus. And I've spent many hours in worship there, and I have attended other Quaker meetings in other places when I lived elsewhere. And I guess kind of some Quaker values lead me to my subjects and what to write about. And then secondly, I really believe that the way to get to know people is not to kind of grill them with like a typed list of questions, which is how sometimes journalists go about trying to get to know other people, but rather to make yourself available and communicate your openness and your interest and see what people want to offer you. And I think that the part that I read earlier about Jacqueline wanting to share a letter with me That came about because I didn't ask her a whole lot of questions. I didn't grill her on why was she wearing a headscarf or why wasn't she. Sometimes I did ask 1 or 2 questions of her, but I really let her answer how she wanted to answer. And mostly we talked about what she wanted to talk about. And I think that letter was just such a gift. And to see how eloquent she was, but also what the loss of her father meant. And that was a loss that came about in a war we fought with her country. And so it was really important. We're kind of responsible for the loss of her father, I think. We and the collapse of Iraq. There's a lot of parties with some responsibility. And when wars take place far away, it's hard maybe to appreciate the impact on families and children, but it's that deep and it's that significant. But somebody's not going to open up and share that with you if you're like crashing through the forest yelling questions at them. I think you really have to my technique or process is to try to be a quiet presence and allow people to share things with me if they want things to be shared with the world, and communicate that the avenue is here if you want to take it and the choice is yours. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. So I cannot see very well.
Yeah, we can just see the first 3 rows only.
Yeah.
The rest of you are invisible to us.
Is there a question or a mic or a person? Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, you said that you were just sitting kind of waiting for people to come to you.
I guess that's kind of metaphorical, but yeah.
Didn't you feel pressure from your editors to get something?
Okay, so the question is, I'm describing myself as sitting waiting for people to come to me. Didn't I feel pressure from my editors? Well, I have a very patient editor, first, and I didn't actually write a book proposal and bring it to him until, I guess, February of the school year. So all those months, from August to February, I was sitting in that classroom not knowing if I was going to pursue a book or not going to pursue a book. And it was really only when I did the home interviews with the 2 families I got to know very well, and then was able to write a proposal and go to New York and speak with my editor. But we were already 6 months into the school year. So I know that's it's unusual, but I took that time because I thought there might be a book here. I certainly felt pressure after that when he said, great, let's sign you up to write this book, for sure. But I knew that my relationships with these families were very tenuous and very delicate, and that, I'm not an Arabic speaker, I'm not a Muslim woman, I don't come from the Middle East, I don't speak Swahili. At the point when I was getting to know the family from the Congo, I hadn't been there. I visited a family at home. They were originally from Burma, again, in a language I don't know. I mean, these relationships were very precious and very hard to establish, and utterly, utterly facilitated by the translators, who themselves were former refugees in every case. So they not only spoke the language of the family, they had lived through the circumstances of the family. And the translators are written about in the book because this wasn't I couldn't do the story without them, and it wasn't a one-on-one relationship. It was a completely mediated relationship. It was for sure a 3-way situation with the translators facilitating these stories being told. I fully believe that the families shared the stories first with the translator, and then the translator shared the story with me because they had faith in the translator, not me, right? And so I felt pressure from my editor, yes. I had to ultimately get something that we could call a book, but it was really important to me to honor the pace at which the families wanted to go. So I tried to follow their lead. And different families, and I kind of write about this in the book, wind up sharing their stories with me at different paces. And Ebtisam and her family were actually one of the more open families, more rapidly open. I could probably go on and on about that, but I'm sure there's other questions too.
Looks like we have a question over here.
Yes. First of all, as a reader, I just want to say how grateful I am for how authentically you entered into the relationships with the families as a proxy for us as the reader. It just really did change the way that I thought about so many issues and people, and I just can't describe how impactful it was. Given that, and how challenging it must have been to sit in authentic presence with these families, how difficult was it to then craft the narratives for each one of the families and then weave them together?
Well, I have a method that I will call the Post-it note method, which I'll get to. But before I say that, I had so much practice as a kid growing up, so that I think prepared me for this. So my mom grew up on a dairy farm in rural Ireland, and my dad grew up in Dublin. And every other summer or thereabouts, they immigrated to this country in 1966 with me when I was 1, and I grew up here with a green card. But every other summer we would go spend hours sitting with family. And we'd be trying to explain life in the United States to them, and they'd be telling us how life was going in Ireland. So there was something that resonated for me with the experience of like newly arrived families here trying to tell me about their journeys. It just was not the same thing as my childhood, but my childhood, it just was very reminiscent of these long hours with my relatives when I was growing up, and me trying to make sense of life in Ireland and us trying to explain the difference of life here. And when I was growing up, my mom did not read to us. She told us stories of life on the farm over and over. And I think it was because she was nostalgic for home and a little bit alone in the United States. And it was how she kind of maybe comforted herself or made herself. She wanted us to know her background, her childhood. So I was very used to like listening to somebody tell stories of another place. Anyhow, you were asking about
the Post-it note method.
Yeah. So after gathering, listening to these families, I would tape record our interviews. I would send those off to be transcribed by now the online transcribing companies that exist. I would listen to the recording again and read the transcript. I would think a lot about how to tell this story. It was clear to me because I had written other books because I had written other books, it was clear to me that I knew I had some instincts for how I wanted to structure it. I knew I wanted every other chapter to be in the classroom, and then the alternating chapters to be one family's home, another family's home, another family's home, back and forth. So I had color-coded Post-it notes. My neighbors know when I'm writing a book because they see the Post-it notes. I put them on the window in my office, and they're like, you're writing another book, huh? Like 52 Post-it notes on my window. So they're color-coded, so all the if something happened in the classroom that felt to me like it would be a scene, I'd write it on a Post-it note what that scene was. Like, Jacqueline hands me letter, that would be a Post-it note. And that would be blue because it happened in the classroom. So I'd have all the blue Post-it notes, but they had to be interspersed with yellow Post-it notes for the family from Iraq and, red Post-it notes for the family from the Congo. So I had a kind of color-coded way to see what the story was. And if I had like way too many blue Post-it notes over here, I'd move some to later. so I'm a visual thinker, and I structured the book on my window in my office with my Post-it notes, color-coded so I could, at a glance, see, was I spending too much time in the classroom, or, gosh, I better get to visit the other family because it's all yellow, no blue, or no red, and that was the method for structuring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Yep. So I've got a few things I'm curious about. First of all, how do you feel about the lack of compassion in today's society and the lack of acceptance? And how can we combat that and bring this to awareness? As I'm a freshman who's interested in gender women's studies major, so I'm kind of curious what kind of feelings you're going through, what things that you think will be workable to change, bring change to our society, and also at large, give us a more in-depth look at basically how we can change things.
I love your question. I just love your question. You give me hope for the future that that's what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm 18. I'm one of the youngest people here.
We are going to do great as a country if everybody who is your age can remind us that this is what matters. And I just love that you're asking about compassion. I know it's a very, very brutally hard time right now in the United States around compassion. I know the environment is kind of toxic, whether you feel that it's the political environment or the media environment, that stew where those two things meet is tough. But I feel that you have obviously a great heart, and so do, I am sure, all of the other young people who are in this room. And I remember once saying to my son, you know, your heart is like a compass, and it is your instrument to figure out how you want to go forward. And it's always going to steer you in the right way. And if you can just know your heart and pay attention to your heart, it's going to be your best guide. And so your heart is going to point you toward compassion. It will. That's what it does. And if you can look to it to say, what direction should I go in? It will always lead you in the right direction. Personally, myself, with that kind of question on my mind, I'm trying to surround myself with stories and news of compassionate acts or news that helps me feel compassion for others. And I'm trying to ignore that part of our news cycle that makes me feel negative emotions. There's a lot of news these days where I'm only reading the headline and I am not getting into the weeds because it's too much. It's just overwhelming. It's important to follow the news, I feel. It's important to know what's happening in politics. It's important to know what's happening in the workplace. It's important to know what's happening in gender relations. But I also want to go forward every day feeling mindful and present and able to be generous to other human beings and not super stressed out, incredibly anxious. And if I just take a bath in some of the news these days, it's like hard to even function because the news is really very grinding right now. So I want to acknowledge the reason you're asking the question because it's a tough climate, but I just feel if you can keep asking that question and more of us can keep asking that question, we are going to wind up in a much better place.
Another question?
I have a question back here. Way in the back, you can't
Oh,
see me.
yes, now I see you. Thank you.
So my question is more one of just curiosity based on all the newcomers that you've met. in my head, I question the philosophy of a stew in America, where all these people come from their different cultural backgrounds, but they kind of stay tight-knit, and that makes up a stew in the United States, versus the melting pot idea where we force people to speak English and to assimilate. I think we have a generational change where previous immigrant families, they didn't speak their native language in the home because they wanted their children to assimilate and to be American, so they don't know their heritage per se. And I was just wondering, based on the newcomers that you've met, if you have a preference for either a stew philosophy or a melting pot philosophy.
You know, this is a great question. I know that, you know, the ability to communicate with one another is really important. This issue of learning a new language, though, my parents didn't have that challenge here. So we didn't live through personally, although we immigrated to this country, we arrived with English. So we didn't personally live through the hardship of having to acquire English. My dad did learn in a second language when he was in high school, because in his day, in the 1950s in Dublin, he went to a school where it was Christian brothers were teaching, and everything was taught in Gaelic. And that was an effort in Ireland to resurrect Gaelic, which had been eliminated by the British during the colonial era. And so that was a very interesting experience for my dad, a very hard experience. It was a really tough environment. The Christian brothers were famous for very harsh discipline. So I know from him the challenges of learning subjects in not your first language. What I saw in the newcomer families, I saw teenagers in high school and younger children in middle school and elementary school sailing into English for the most part. Learning English so fast, it was astonishing to me. At one point in the book, I note that halfway through the school year, one student's vocabulary words, he was at the head of the class, in the newcomer room. This is just months after his arrival. His vocabulary words were prodigious, compromise, and racism. And he had come to me to ask would I explain those words to him. I was like, wow. Just love seeing that these are the words the teacher's giving you. He was sailing forward even faster than most kids in the room. So the young people in the families were learning English at just an astonishing rate, and their parents were not. Their parents were attempting to learn English. They were trying so hard to learn English, but it was much more difficult for them for a number of reasons. First of all, they were working full-time or more than full-time, working extraordinary hours, very difficult jobs, extremely exhausting. They were working so hard to pay the rent in a city that was becoming less and less affordable by the minute. And then also they were older and their brains just were less able to absorb a new language. And so it was very hard to find the time, and even when they did find the time, it was very hard to make sense of English. And so the parents were kind of sacrificing themselves in these very difficult low-wage jobs so that their kids could stay in school, so that their kids could fully assimilate into this country. So it doesn't really answer the question that you were asking exactly. I'm just saying that what I was seeing was a generational difference with kids fully assimilating and parents kind of not out of a desire, but just really out of like, there's only so many hours in the day, and kind of the economic difficulty of keeping the families afloat, working so hard. They were not sailing into English. So there's a big generational split on that front in terms of assimilation. I guess that would just be what I observe. And if I could wave a magic wand, I'd give everybody English. Everybody I know would like to speak English. Everybody I met, there was nobody who arrived thinking, nah, I don't want English. That just doesn't, no, nobody thinks that way. Nobody I've met. But it's hard to acquire. Yeah. There's somebody standing up, and okay. Hi, I don't mind who goes first.
It's kind of a follow-on to the last conversation. It was intriguing to hear you. I grew up in an immigrant family in the 50s, and experienced a lot of the things that you're talking about. And what I was curious about was, when I was growing up, the thing that we wanted to do as kids was to be assimilated in the American culture and kind of shove aside the old world. And I look back on that now and I go, God, that was stupid. But the question I have is, did you find the same thing with the kids that you were experiencing? Are they wanting to be quickly assimilated and throw off the old world culture, or are they struggling with how to deal with that?
I guess I would say kind of yes and kind of no. So Jacqueline and Mariam, it was really important to them to stay on top of news from the Middle East, especially as they identified so strongly with refugee families who were still there. So they were constantly, they were really absorbed by the news cycle of the Middle East and the conflict in Syria, and this question of whether families they knew were going to make it out of Syria safely or not. They found it relaxing to leave the English world behind after the school day and retreat into the Arabic-speaking world of home, or the Middle Eastern news. Like, they would watch talk shows from the Middle East, and they would listen to music from the Middle East, and it was very relaxing for them after a hard day of trying to learn English to listen to music where they could understand the lyrics and not work, but just enjoy. So there was great pleasure in returning to the home language. Their Middle Eastern identity was important to them, and they wanted to be treated with respect. And then at the same time, they were also very eager to become American. So they were trying to have it both ways, really, I would say. They wanted to maintain the tie to home and become fluent in how to be the kind of American student at school that would be accepted and popular, and yeah. They wanted to belong in school. Yeah.
I worked in Denver Public Schools for 28 years, and you were commenting on how the families really supported their children to be successful in school and worked very hard to make that happen. And I saw that every day. I worked with young kids, and the parents would work 2 jobs. The mother would come to school and volunteer, and she'd go to work in the evening, and the dad was working all day long. And so I wanted to comment on that because I just heard that. But what I really wanted to say was, in your book, the thing I loved the most is I started reading it and I thought, oh my gosh, this author is coming into this classroom. I mean, I wasn't in high school, but I was with young children and a teacher, and I thought, oh my gosh, how intimidating would that be for me to have an
Poor
author
Mr.
come into my
Williams.
classroom and for a whole year.
Oh, I know.
And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You never were judgmental to the teacher. I never heard a word in the book about judging how that teacher taught. I felt like, this guy must have been a pretty good teacher. And you were never judgmental to the students. That wasn't what your message was at all. And I loved that. And that's all I really wanted to say, was that I appreciated it. And I would have been really intimidated if you'd come into my book.
I have to say that I think that it was very hard for Eddie Williams to have me in the classroom. Yes. And also, he's such a kind, thoughtful, person that he tried very hard not to ever indicate that to me. But it had to be true that it was very intimidating to have a journalist in your classroom the whole year. But the great moment really was when about 3-4 months in, he came to me and said, I don't like having you at this table with like your notebook so much. I want you to interact with the students. And I said, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Is that a good idea? I mean, I really don't want to confuse them. I want them to know that I'm a journalist. I'm trying to tell them a writer as soon as we're able to communicate. So I don't want them to think that I work here. It's important that they know that I don't, and they don't have to talk to me. And he was like, yeah, no, you need to put the notebook down and work with the kids.
And you addressed that in the book
Yeah.
at some place. I read it a while ago.
Yeah.
But I think
so
you
I think he
addressed that.
found it off-putting, and he knew they found it off-putting. He said, you need to become part of our community.
Yeah.
And he was right.
Yeah, both the two, I haven't read the Soldier book, but I read both of the DPS books, and
Yeah.
they're amazing.
Thank you.
It is a tribute to young people. It's a tribute. So
I
thank
think-
you.
I think we have time for just one more question, and it
Okay.
looks like we have someone over here.
Great.
Hi, my name is Susan Walter. I'm a faculty member here on campus, and I work with a group of first-year students. And so I wanted to share a couple of things with you that I thought you would find interesting. First of all, I really loved that reading that you did for us at the beginning, in part because you talked about this idea of respect. And just today in class with my first-year students, we were doing an activity in which we had to talk about, it was an activity around sort of thinking about who we are as individuals and how those values that we hold can tie into our majors. And so the first activity was sort of answering or filling in the blank with this statement of blank is what matters. And one of my students this morning said, respect is what matters. And so I thought that fit really nicely with what you were talking about. And we had some conversations around your book in our class the first week and a half or so. And I think what resonated with me most in terms of what students shared about their experience of reading the book was this idea that in the media environment in which we live in, we're so bombarded with such sort of black and white versions of what's happening in the world, that they really loved that they felt that, like, they got some of the grays and they got some faces, right? We got sort of those personal human stories around this really tragic refugee crisis that the world is living through at the moment. And so I thought that was really powerful for our first-year students, obviously, and a great way to sort of open up conversations about who we are and what can we contribute in a university campus. And then sort of to follow up on that idea, the other thing that came up in our class a lot as we were talking about the book and talking about some readings we did that related to research around the refugee crisis was often students wanted to know more. They wanted to know, what might I do on an individual basis to sort of help contribute to making life a little bit easier for these families and these students as they integrate into American culture? And then B, what are the best resources to maybe understand on a more macro level what's happening with refugees? We wondered, these individuals that we met in the book and we felt like we got to know, how well are they doing now? So that question that Heather asked earlier around that. But just sort of what are some of those resources that we might find online that give us some sense of how successful are most refugee families in finding stable employment? How many refugee kids end up going to college or end up having sort of, successful futures in different ways?
Yeah. Well, the best, I think, kind of daily aggregated news comes, I have found, from the United Nations. So you can go to the United Nations website and sign up for their daily news brief about refugees. And one thing that I really love about it is that the people putting it together are really aware of the emotional impact that the news has. And they make sure to include really positive, really uplifting stories about the amazing things that refugees are doing. So there's information like the BBC News story that I shared with you about the overall numbers. There's information about specific conflicts in countries producing refugees. But at the end of every news brief, there's something called Get Inspired. And it's the personal story of some refugee who has left some absolutely, horrifying situation behind, started over, and created some amazing kind of success. And there's a very high level of entrepreneurship with refugees because they are people who are good at figuring things out and getting things done and figuring out how to get from point A to point B. So I just love that in that news brief, there's celebratory things as well. The UN social media is also great. It's very visual, it's very, they know how to speak in a Twitter-length format and yet convey really sophisticated things. So that's a great place to start. The BBC and The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, are also the two best news outlets, and The Economist magazine are the three best news outlets, I think, covering international relations and the refugee situation. The Wall Street Journal has some really good reporting too, and the New York Times. I think there were some other questions that you asked in addition to that.
Well, I just asked sort of ways that students or other community members might get involved to sort of help refugee families in the Denver area in particular.
Thank you. I do list on my website under a tab called Engage, there's just a list of the local refugee serving organizations, and you can click through to all their websites. So there are different ways to get engaged. One thing anybody can do if they want is write a check, doesn't matter for how much, it can be for $10, and you can help that organization that way. But also you can give time if you have time to give. And there are different ways to interact, but I'll just describe one that I think is really amazing. So sometimes refugee kids or asylum-seeking kids or immigrant kids are fully assimilating through our school system. And like I say, parents have a harder time learning English. In some cases, the father might be working and the mom might be at home with younger children. And sometimes it is that mom who's at home with younger children who is the last person in the family to get any English and the most isolated and can have the hardest time. So there's a program that Emily Griffith Technical College hosts, and it's for home tutors. And anybody can sign up. There's a 4-month waiting list of moms, mostly moms, hoping for home tutors to come help them at home. And anybody here who has time to give could sign up. They're desperate for more home tutors. Go work with that person, speaking English with them in their home. It could be even just half an hour a week or an hour a week, and you can make a huge difference in that person's life. So the home tutoring is one thing where I know there's a real need for volunteers, but there's all sorts of other opportunities as well to connect with families. The African Community Center, Lutheran Family Services, International Rescue Committee, Project Worthmore, and Emily Griffith would be 5 organizations that I can think of just off the top of my head that all have ways for people to connect one-on-one and kind of really get to know other people.
I think LP will be out with some final remarks, but please join me in thanking Helen Thorpe for
And for, I don't know if this is on yet, and for our moderator, of course, Heather Martin. Let's give her a round of applause as well. Thank you. This has been so wonderful. So to wrap up, I'd like to look ahead. As I mentioned earlier, One Book, One DU is a program dedicated to building community through a series of shared intellectual experiences inspired by a common text. Now, in our 4th year, the program seeks to provide opportunities for our campus to reflect on the roots of our beliefs, our aspirations, our values, and to consider how we can leverage our collective experiences toward the university's mission of contributing to the public good. With our 4th selection, the Newcomers, our campus has the chance to consider what roles we can play as individuals, as a campus, as part of the Denver and Colorado communities, in welcoming newcomers. Tonight's event is just one of many opportunities for continued dialogue. For instance, DU is hosting the 2019 Colorado Migra Hack this Friday and Saturday on campus. Sounds really great. Please check that out on our website. And also inspired by the book's skillful use of narrative to humanize these global issues, this year's shared prompt, a creative writing prompt, invites us to think of a time when we've welcomed a newcomer, or perhaps have even been a newcomer. Because storytelling can provide us a sense of agency, can help us connect, can help us understand our role in the world. And so our first year students, many of whom are here tonight, have a chance to share their prompt response at Encountering Stories. Submissions are due September 30th, this coming Monday. I believe we have flyers outside waiting for you in the foyer. But also, we publish a book every spring that opens up this prompt to all members of our community. We welcome stories from everyone. So for these event details and more, and to provide feedback on the future books, authors, themes, whatever, please visit our website, du.edu/onebook. So thank you, all of you, for being such a tremendous audience and having wonderful questions for us. Thank you to the university academic programs and our partners for this event, the Newman Center. Thank you, Helen Thorpe, for not only writing this incredible book, but being with us here tonight. A round of applause, you all deserve it. Thank you so much for coming out. That is all we have.